Hey everybody, so this video is over operational definitions. Now I wanted to do this video especially because one of the key things about operational definitions is going from metaphor to number. Now what do I mean by that? Well, some of the variables that we talk about in psychology don't have a single counterpart. So many of our variables are somewhat abstract. So for example, if we're talking about an attitude, okay, well in the psychology literature, what an attitude is a global evaluation of something. All right, so you can have an attitude literally about anything, and according to attitudes research, you have an attitude about everything that you've ever encountered. But if we wanted to look at the persuasion process, the process of changing a person's attitude, we have to find a concrete way to measure an attitude. All right, so measure a person's evaluation of something. So I dabble a little bit in political ideology, in political attitudes. Well, how do we measure that? Well, that's what an operational definition gives us. So an operational definition gives us a working definition that we use to operate with it, that we operate with the variable. Okay, it's never a good decision to use parts of the word in the definition. So what I'll say is an operational definition is a way of concretely working with some somewhat abstract concept. Okay, so I just talked about an attitude. So, okay, how do we know that this persuasion process affects an attitude? Okay, well, we'll just go with a traditional, standard effect, very reliably found in the research literature, and that is that if a person is carefully considering a message, then they become sensitive to what's called argument quality, or how well a argument is constructed. All right, so right there. So the simple study of looking at the effect of argument quality on persuasion or movement in an attitude, okay, we've got two things that are very metaphorical, very abstract. Okay, how do we pin that down? How do we identify operational definitions for those things? Well, the principal purpose of an operational definition, again, is to give us something to work with that actually represents the concepts that we're trying to talk about. Okay, so let's not talk about the IV for a second. Let's just talk about the DV. Change in attitude. Okay, so let's use an attitude object. What are we going to convince or try to change a person's attitude about? Let's say that we're going to try to change their attitude about requiring comprehensive exams for graduation. Okay, now people in our program are required to complete comprehensive exams, but let's say that you are in a program that comprehensive exams aren't required yet. Okay, so our attitudes about comprehensive exams, again, an attitude is just an evaluation, so you can simply ask. There's a number of ways that you can gauge a person's evaluation of that attitude object, okay? But again, we're trying to gauge change in the attitude, so, or persuasion. So we might say, have two groups, randomly assign between the groups. By randomly assigning between the groups, we can fairly safely assume that the two groups are roughly equivalent on their initial attitude towards comprehensive exams. Okay. Now, how do we get from the metaphor of an attitude towards comprehensive exams to something we can actually measure, to a number? All right. Well, the easiest way to do it is just ask them on using a survey question on a Likert scale from 1 to 7. You know, to what extent do you think comprehensive exams should be required for people to graduate? All right, 1 meaning, and on the scale, the Likert scale, 1 to 7, 1 meaning not at all, 7 meaning very much. Okay, so if you answered the question, to what extent do you think that people should be required to take comprehensive exams in order to graduate? If the participant responded with a 1, no, they don't think they should. They don't agree at all that people should be required to take comprehensive exams in order to graduate. But if they answered with 7, then they agree very much with the idea that people should be required to take comprehensive exams in order to graduate. So, so the question is, to what extent you agree that people should be required to take mandatory exams? Now, I know some of you might ask, well, if you're gauging change, why don't you measure what their attitude was before you gave them a persuasive message, before you tried to persuade them, and then measure it after? Because then you could tell if it changed, right? The problem with that, and that's called a pre-post test design, and you'll learn a little bit about that in the class. And I don't know if this book does it, but I know in another research methods book it says explicitly another name for a pre-post test design is a bad design. Pre-post tests tend to be one of the worst research method designs available. So what are the problems with a pre-post in this particular instance? Well, there's something called conversational norms. Okay, so if I ask you, and one of those conversational norms is consistency. So if I were to ask you, how do you feel today? And you were to say, oh, pretty good. And then 3 minutes later, I ask you, so how do you feel today? You would be compelled to answer the exact same way you answered the first time, because not much time has passed, not much has changed. You would be compelled to answer the same way you did the first time, or at least very similarly. All right, so that conversational norm creates variance in our DV, the final question, the second question, that we don't want. All right, because it restricts their response in a way that is not reflective of what we're trying to change, what we're trying to look at, which is the effectiveness of persuasion. But if we randomly assign people to 2 groups, all right, then by the essentially, it's not magic, but by the laws of probability, we can fairly safely, and if we do this enough times over enough experiments, we can be even more confident in this. But if we randomly assign participants to 2 groups, we can be fairly safe in assuming that the 2 groups, on average, are fairly equivalent in their initial attitudes towards, in our case, the idea of requiring comprehensive exams prior to graduation. Okay, so we can safely assume that any difference between the groups reflects change due to whatever we manipulate. All right, so we've got our operational definition of their attitude towards comprehensive exams, or requiring comprehensive exams. Okay, but just to review really briefly, I want to make it very clear that our operational definition is the responses to a question about the extent to which they agree with requiring mandatory comprehensive exams for graduation. All right, that's our operational definition of attitude towards comprehensive exams, or our operational definition of attitudes. So part of attitudes research is first identifying an attitude object to work with. That's the first thing you need to do when developing your operational definition for attitudes research. But not all of you are going to do attitudes research, and not all of the questions on the assignment this week are attitudes research. In fact, I don't think any of them are. Just off the top of my head, I don't remember any. So, you might deal with something else, like let's say you wanted to measure aggression. Okay, well, okay, how are you going to measure aggression? Well, I know what many people are inclined to say, well, I'll just measure how aggressive they are. But again, An operational definition requires you to go from metaphor to number, you to identify a way we can get a number from your measure. Okay, so you're going to measure how aggressive they are. Okay, what do you mean by that? What things are you going to count as aggressive? How are you going to count aggression? Are you going to have them tell you how aggressive they are? Are you going to have observers watch them? If you're going to have observers watch them, what are you going to have them look at and count? So all these things, again, we have to go from the abstract to the very concrete when we're making an operational definition. Okay, so for example, if you wanted to measure aggression, you could use, if you wanted to operationalize aggression, you could use a aggression measure. So you give them a series of scenarios. There's a number of measures out there, and it's always best to use an established measure first. But an example, so in one of the aggression measures, it's developed by Kenrick. It gives participants a scenario that could be aggression provoking, and then it asks them to what extent they think they would be likely to engage in a number of behaviors. How likely do they think that they would hit the person? How likely do they think that they would talk bad about the person to others behind their back? And it has a number of these aggressive items. Some identified as direct aggression, hitting, pushing, things like that, and indirect aggression, saying something behind their back, spreading a bad rumor, things of that nature. That's one way to operationalize it. But you see, the operationalization is the likelihood the participant indicates they would be to engage in each of a number of behaviors, and then it has the specific behaviors: punching, pushing, things like that. All right. So we go from the abstract to the very concrete. All right. Now let's say that you didn't want them to fill out a survey, so you didn't want to use survey methods. You wanted to use observational methods. Okay, well, that's fine. But then it becomes important in your operational definition to tell me exactly what it is they're going to look for. So, Bandura, in his classic study, he might operationalize the children's. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Bandura's famous study, it was a famous study on modeling behavior. He showed children videos of adults interacting with toys in a room, and some children saw a video of the parents playing nicely with all the toys. Other children saw a video of the parents playing somewhat violently with the toys. For example, there was a Bobo doll. If you're not familiar with what a Bobo doll is, the one I saw was of a clown, but it's basically a big rubber balloon with sand in the bottom, and so if you punch it, it flops down and it comes back up. It's a Bobo doll. So in the video of the parents playing nicely, none of them punched the Bobo doll. In the video of the parents playing violently, the parents would punch the Bobo doll. Then Bandura allowed the children, after seeing one of the two videos, they didn't see both, they saw one or the other. After seeing the video, they went in and were allowed to play in the same room that they saw in the video. And his operational definition of the children's aggression was the number of times the children punched the Bobo doll. All right, so he's using an observational method. He's watching, but he's watching a specific thing. All right, he's watching something that he can, very concrete, that he can count. All right, the number of times children punched the Bobo doll. Lo and behold, when children saw a video of parents punching the Bobo doll, they punched the Bobo doll more times than did the children who saw the video of the parents playing nicely. All right, so again, here with aggression, we have an observational operational definition. So it's a different operational definition of the same concept, aggression. But both of these options, the Likert scales on Kenrick's measure of aggression, counting the number of times they punch a Bobo doll, these are both ways of taking an abstract concept, aggression, and giving us a measurable entity, something we can count. All right, something that will give us a number. And that's one of the biggest elements of the operational definitions of measures. Okay, so if you're measuring depression, how are you going to measure it? All right, you're going to count the number of symptoms they have, or are you going to use their responses on a established measure like the Beck Depression Inventory? How are you going to get a numerical representation of that concept? Okay, but that's all with measures. Now, when it comes to manipulations, it gets a little bit more tricky. So let's go back to our original example study. The effect of argument quality on attitudes. Okay, towards requiring the mandatory comprehensive exams for graduation. Well, what we're manipulating here is argument quality. Okay, well, what does argument quality mean? Well, if you go and read those articles, which I really think you should, because they're really great articles and they're standard reading. They're classic. Many of them are classic at this point. It's great, really cool stuff. If you're interested, go check out any stuff by Casiopo and Petty over their elaboration likelihood model. If you're interested at all, go check that out. It's really cool. But anyway, so how would we operationalize message quality? Well, the way Casiopo and Petty did it was that they would write two versions of the same persuasive message. Again, they were trying to look at the effect look at movement in participants' attitudes towards comprehensive exams. So they had two messages, two arguments that they wrote that were in favor of comprehensive exams. One of them provides very logical, very straightforward, coherent arguments, really impactful consequences of having comprehensive exams. I think one of them was, employers tend to be more favorable of those required to pass comprehensive exams in order to graduate. And I think one of the weak arguments was something like many schools are requiring comprehensive exams now. So you can see how one is a legitimate, logical benefit. The other, it's just conforming. Big deal. So those are just examples. I don't remember all the ways that they changed it, but those things are crucial. So the way they're operationally defining it is things that provide, in the strong argument, not strong quality argument, things that provide a clear, blatant advantage in favor of requiring comprehensive exams, and the other are kind of cliche, unimpactful, somewhat irrelevant pros. And in the studies they gave, or at least in the early studies, they gave the essays that they used. All right. So here, what we're operationally defining is argument quality. All right, because that's what we're manipulating. At the beginning of this video, for the majority of the video so far, we've been talking about operationally defining measures. So how am I going to measure attitudes? How am I going to measure aggression? All right, it's a matter of finding a way to concretely get a numerical representation of some concept. Well, when we're talking about manipulating it, an operational definition refers to how we're changing some concept that we are trying to manipulate. So in this situation, they're trying to manipulate argument quality. All right. So how are they going to do that? In concrete terms, how are they going to do that? Well, they create two messages. One that has strong reasons in favor of requiring mandatory comprehensive exams, and a second message also in favor of requiring mandatory comprehensive exams, but with weaker reasons. All right. So when it comes to operational definitions for manipulations, for IVs, for independent variables, it becomes important to make sure that your IV is actually changing the thing you want to change. Now, in addition to just saying, hey, we designed it this way to do this thing, oftentimes, and in the better studies this is the case, what will happen is that the researcher will do tests on their IV to make sure that it's doing the things that they're wanting it to do. So, for example, they might pilot test it. So one thing that Cassiope and Petty might do is they create those two versions, and they have a pilot group. Just read the two versions and then say, how high quality do you think this message is? How good of reasons do you think the reasons are given in this message are? How strong do you think the reasons are? And they might do that for each of them. Okay, and again, they do this to make sure that yes, the high quality message or the strong message is perceived as being stronger, as having better reasons than the weaker quality argument. If they don't pilot test it, they might do a manipulation check. So they might ask those same kinds of questions during the study after the DV. So, they might have gotten either the participant might have gotten the strong or the weak argument. They might have measured the participant's attitude towards requiring mandatory exams, and then they might ask them that question of how strong do you think the argument was, how good do you think the reasons provided were, things like that. So that's a manipulation check. So it's done during the study. Another thing that is often done, and this is this is done more so with measures, less so with manipulations, because it's not as effective as a way to double check yourself when we're talking about manipulations, and that's to use a face valid manipulation. All right. So if you're manipulating aggression, whether or not they're angry, in one you have them talk about the weather. In the angry inducing condition, you have them write about something that pissed them off. All right. Well, that's very face valid. All right. It's very clear that there's no reason they should get angry when writing about the weather. Well, I guess there could be remote reasons, but on average, there wouldn't be a standard reason to expect that people writing about the weather would get pissed. Whereas if we explicitly ask them to write about something that pissed them off or made them mad, then we have a very face valid reason to expect that that manipulation would make them angry. All right. Another way, and this is another one of the more common methods, is to use a manipulation that has been used by others. All right, but that can get tricky. All right, because many times manipulations, because researchers, they design their studies for their samples. It's not going to do me any good to use an argument that's strong, that's judged to be strong by Cameron students, to then try and change New Yorkers' attitudes towards requiring mandatory exams. Because what Cameron thinks is a strong, good argument may not be the same thing that New Yorkers think is a strong and good argument. So using manipulations done by others, it's an approved way of doing things, but you have to be careful because there is always the chance that these manipulations were designed for a specific sample and for a specific instance, and may not be interpreted the same way by your sample. Okay, so probably the best way to make sure that your operational definition is valid and manipulates the variable you want it to manipulate is to use a pilot test. Again, so an example is if you have a strong argument and a weak argument for favoring mandatory exams prior to graduation, you would give a small sample of people, those two, before you do your main study, give a small sample of people, those two arguments, and have them rate them. So how strong do you think this argument is? How good are the reasons do you think are provided in this one? And that way you have some way of showing, hey, other people, not the people in my experiment, other people who are similar to the people in my experiment think that this argument is strong and this argument is weak. And then that way you can have more confidence in the validity of the operational of the operational definition you're using for your independent variable. Okay, so again, let's go back to our example study. We're looking at the effect of argument quality on attitudes toward on attitudes. Okay, the attitude object we're using is requiring mandatory comprehensive exams for graduation. Now, so we've operationally defined argument quality as a strong argument in favor of requiring mandatory comprehensive exam, in favor of requiring comprehensive exams, and a weak argument for requiring comprehensive exams. And we have operationally defined, we can be confident in our operational definition because we've pilot tested them, and we have a subgroup of people saying yes, the strong argument is indeed strong, and no, and yes, the weak argument is weak. Okay, and we're measuring attitudes. Let's use the standard way of, just asking them to what extent do you agree that comprehensive exams should be mandatory, using a Likert scale 1 to 7. That's our operational definition. Their response on that Likert scale. All right. So if we find that people who got the strong message had an average agreement of, let's say, 6.5, and people in the, well, I don't think anybody really wants mandatory exams unless they're an employer. I'm pretty sure students don't want them. So let's say that all of our participants are students. So the people in the strong, who received the strong argument, they all rate it as a 5. They all agree with it on that Likert scale from 1 to 7 with an average rating of 5. And those who received the weak argument agree on that Likert scale with an average rating of 3. Okay, well, now we know, if we look at the distribution of scores for both groups, if there's not significant overlap between the distribution, all right, then we can between the distribution of the scores from our participants in both groups, then we can be fairly confident that strong messages affect attitudes. Now, the attitude object that we used is fairly irrelevant. We could have used, in the example that we've used mandatory comprehensive exams, but we could have used attitude objects towards anything. I think another common attitude object is beautification of the campus. So we could have used any attitude object, but the operational definition is, what is a strong for the our operational definition for the manipulation, or the IV, is what is a strong message, what is a weak message, and our operational definition for our measure is what number, how do we get a numerical representation for our dependent variable. Okay. Now, measures can also be considered predictors or akin to IVs, in which case you have the same problem that you do with all measure, operationally defining all measures. You need a numerical representation for something. So if you wanted to study the effect of social support on depressive symptoms, okay, well, you can use, if it's not exactly ethical to manipulate the social support that a person receives in their life. Now, I guess you could use a social exclusion method. So, if you exclude some, you don't exclude others. But in general, you can't ethically manipulate the amount of social support a person receives in their life. So for that reason, oftentimes you have to, and this is a problem common to clinical psychology research, it's oftentimes you have to just measure it. Okay, well then you need some way to operationally define social support in a way that gives you a numerical representation of social support. And there's surveys that and questionnaires that have participants rate on a scale certain items that assess the amount of social support they think that they have. And then you can sum those scores or aggregate those scores in some way specified by the measure to give you a numerical representation of the social support they have. And then you can look at the correlate, and then you can give them the BDM, the Beck Depression Inventory, as a measure of the severity of their depression. And then you can look at the correlation between the two. And if there's a positive correlation, then a negative correlation, then you know that as social support increases, severity of depression decline or decreases. All right. So that was what I wanted to address in this video. It's a lengthy video, and I apologize for that. But I hope that I've given you some clear items. And just to quickly review, when we're operationally defining a measure, we want to find a way that very concretely, in very concrete terms, gives us a numerical representation. Okay, so count the number of times certain things happen, ratings on a Likert scale, with the ends of the Likert scale meaning something, you know, so 1 meaning not at all, 7 meaning very much, in response to a question of, excuse me, how likely are you to hit someone, you know. So, you know, again, aggression. We could use a Likert scale, so how likely are you to hit someone on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 meaning not at all, 7 meaning very much, or we could actually measure the amount of times that they hit someone in a anger-provoking situation. So both of those are perfectly valid operational definitions, but we have to choose one. And any operational definition, even if we're not talking about aggression, we've talked about attitudes, we've talked about depression, any operational definition for a measure must give us a concrete number or concrete numerical representation of the concept. Okay, and the operational definition of the IV must give us a clear, concrete way to change whatever independent variable we are hoping to change. Okay, you know, it's more. We've talked about argument quality, but some more straightforward ones would be, so if you were looking at the effect of caffeine on memory, okay, well, then your operational definition of memory could be any number of things. So one standard way of doing this is to give participants lists of words and then wait for 5 minutes and then see how many of those words that they can recall. And then the operational definition is just the number of words that they recall. That's an operational definition of memory. All right. Then their operational definition of, let's see, what are we going to, I don't remember what I just said about the effect of something on memory. Oh, it's caffeine, that's right. So then the operational definition of the effect of caffeine on memory would be participants in one group drink 1 or 2 cups of coffee. You would want to specify 1 or 2. You wouldn't say 1 or 2. You'd specify 1 cup of coffee of so many ounces. All right, so an 8-ounce cup of coffee, so many minutes prior to performing the memory task. Those in the non-caffeine, they drank an 8-ounce glass of water. However many minutes, it should be the same number of minutes before performing the memory task. Okay, so in that, I mean, it's very clear. Your operational definition of your IV, the presence of caffeine, is very clear. They drank an 8-ounce glass of coffee, or they caffeinated coffee, obviously, or they drank an 8-ounce glass of water. All right. So some operational definitions are far more clear, far more straightforward than others. I mean, certainly the operational definition that I was trying to go over for strong and weak arguments is not the clearest, because again, that's a far more abstract concept. Operationally defining abstract concepts gets more difficult as the concept gets more abstract. Okay. So that is what I wanted to cover for operational definitions. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to send them my way. I want to help you guys. I want to help you learn this stuff. Research methods is it's one of my favorite things. It's fun to me to design a good experiment to test a hypothesis. It is fun. So I thoroughly enjoy teaching this class, and if you have any questions, please ask me. But operational definitions is kind of like one of the cornerstones of the rest of what you're going to learn in this class. You have to understand how to operationally define something. Okay, so this video should be helpful in completing the operational definitions assignment. All right, guys, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, like I said, send them my way. But I will talk to you all later on.